It's been fascinating when I read the Quran, because as I read the Quran, I find a lot of the characters in the Quran are the same characters I find in my Bible. You have Abraham, Ibrahim, you have Moses, Moise, you have David, Dawuda, Jesus, Isa, John the Baptist, Yahya. But it's fascinating when you look at the stories in the Quran, they do not parallel the stories I have in my Bible. And I've always scratched my head and I said, hold on a minute, where do these stories come from? They don't parallel the same material. Let's give you some examples. Let's go back to Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel. In Surah 5, Ayah 31, Cain has just killed his brother Abel. He doesn't know what to do with the body. He looks over and he sees a raven scratching in the ground. So he says, well, I'm going to follow what the raven does. And he buries his brother like he sees the raven doing. Terrific story. It's not in my Bible. So where does it come from? We know exactly where it's come from. We've done source criticism on these accounts, and we can go back to them. And we find that in the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, also the Targum of Jerusalem, and also the Birkei Rabbi Eliezer, three different accounts from the 2nd century which talk about the same story. It seems that these were borrowed from those accounts. What's interesting is the next verse, because in verse 32, it suddenly changes. There's a reference there about the blood of Abel. And it mentions that he who takes the blood of one is as if he takes the blood of all, and he who saves the blood of one is as if he saves the blood of all. This is a very popular reference that is used by Muslims today to stipulate that Islam is the religion of peace, because they don't take people's blood, they actually save people by not taking their blood. The difficulty is, what is it doing after verse 31? It seems to almost be a redemptive account. It doesn't belong in that story, until you realize that in the 5th century, there was a scribe who was rewriting the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, and as he was rewriting it, and as the scribes do, in the margins he basically puts an editorial comment on the blood of Abel, and he mentions if you take the blood of one, as if you take the blood of all, and if you save the blood of one, you save the blood of all. Now, when that was incorporated into the Bar Sanhedrin, chapter 4, verse 5, in the 5th century, that story of Cain and Abel and the raven was then followed by this editorial comment on the blood of Abel, taken from that editorial comment in the margins, incorporated into the Bar Sanhedrin, chapter 5, verse 4. And then both that story plus the editorial comment on the blood were then incorporated into the Quran in Surah 5, Ayah 31 and 32. Now what does that tell you? Well, I know what it tells me. It tells me that we now know where this story comes from. It does not come from God. It was not divinely inspired. It was basically written by men. The earlier part written in the 2nd century, and then an editorial comment which was added in the 5th century, put into the document in the 5th century, and then borrowed and incorporated into the Quran, probably the 7th or 8th century. We'll get into that later. Let's look at the story of Abraham in Surah 21. In the story of Abraham in Surah 21, Ayah 51 to 71, we find Abraham in the middle of the night angered by all these idols that he sees. So he takes a large idol and destroys the smaller idols. The next morning, the people come to him and says, what have you done? He says, well, don't ask me, ask the large idol. And of course, they can't talk to the large idol. So they take Abraham and they throw him into a fiery pit. And the angel of the Lord then comes down and rescues him. Now, I sit there and scratch my head again and says, hold on a minute, I don't remember this story in my Bible. Where does it come from? And we've scoured, we've done some source criticism. We know exactly where it comes from. It comes from Midrash Rabbah. Midrash Rabbah was a 2nd century document, an apocryphal account, never assumed to be authoritative by the Jews, and it has the same story, but it's an amalgamation of different references. We can see that in that is a story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the Jews never intended this to be authoritative. It was basically an oral tradition that had been passed down. It was really a fairy tale. And yet, what is it doing in the Quran today? Let's go to Solomon and Sheba. That's even a better story. In Surah 27, if you look in Surah 27, Ayah 17 to 44, you will find the story of Solomon and Sheba. Solomon takes his birds and he uses them in battle. It's the first air force ever invented. And he would take his birds and they would fly up above the enemy and they would drop stones down on the enemy. On the bottom of the stones is the name of the men that they were going to kill. And he would train his birds every day. And every day he would march them. And one day he noticed that the hoopoe bird was missing and he got angered. Where's my hoopoe bird? And he looks to the south and he sees the hoopoe bird flying, lands at his feet. The hoopoe bird talks to him, he talks to birds. And it talks about this beautiful queen in the south, in Sheba. And he must go down and see her. And he says, well, no, you flap on down there and tell her to come and see me. So the hoopoe bird flies back down to Sheba, meets the queen there, and talks about this great king in the north, that she must go and see him. She talks to her retinue, decides that they're all going to come together, and they all come up to Jerusalem to meet this great king in Jerusalem. And they're about ready to enter into the throne room there. And as she's about ready to enter into the throne room, she notices that the floor, she thinks is water. It's actually a mirrored floor. But she doesn't have that technology. That technology doesn't exist in Sheba. And so she picks up her skirts to keep them from getting wet. And that's where it ends in verse 44. Fascinating story, entertaining story. I'd love to know where it comes from. Why is it in my Bible? Well, for one very good reason. We now know where that story comes from. And it comes from the Second Targum of Esther. Again, another 2nd century apocryphal account written basically for entertainment for the children, the Jewish kids at that time in the diaspora. If you look at the Second Targum of Esther and compare it with Surah 27, you will see it's almost exactly the same story, almost word for word, except at the very end. In the Second Targum of Esther, when the Queen of Sheba comes into the throne room and she looks and sees what she thinks is just water, that mirrored floor, she picks up her skirts to keep them from getting wet. According to the Second Targum of Esther, she has hairy legs. Solomon, upon seeing the hairy legs, cries out in surprise. Now, that is not incorporated into the Quranic text for a very good reason. But what does that tell you? What does it tell me? I'll tell you what it tells me. It tells me that this story is basically a man-written story. It has human origins. It does not come from God at all. Muslims believe that these stories have always existed in heaven, and they were sent down piecemeal over a period of 23 years, between 610 and 632, from God down to, through the angel Gabriel, down to Muhammad. Yeah, we can source these stories long before Muhammad even existed. These are 2nd century, 5th century. Muhammad didn't come onto the world stage until the end of the 6th century and on into the 7th century. These are all man-made stories that have been borrowed and incorporated into the Quran. We know who wrote them. We know when they were written. In some cases, we know why they were written. They do not belong in what Muslims claim to be the Word of God. Let's go on to the persons of Jesus Christ. You look and see there's many stories about Jesus in the Quran. And when you look at these stories, they do not parallel the stories we have in the New Testament. They spend most of his time on his childhood. That he speaks from the cradle. He bends down a palm tree and feeds he and his mother. He takes some clay and forms them into birds and blows on them and they fly up into the air. Where do these stories come from? We can trace almost every one of these stories. If you go back and you look, and you will see Jesus' birth, the palm tree, in Surah 19, ayah 22 to 26. That same story is found in the lost books of the Bible. When Jesus talks from the cradle, in Surah 19, ayah 29 to 33. That comes from the first gospel, the infancy of Jesus Christ. The creating the birds from clay that I mentioned earlier in Surah 3, ayah 49. That comes from Thomas's gospel, infancy of Jesus Christ. What are these gospels, infancy of Jesus Christ? These are apocryphal accounts. These are not at all authoritative accounts. They were considered always by the early church to be apocryphal. They were written much later in the 2nd, 3rd century. They are sectarian accounts. Some of them were written by Gnostics, others were written by Collyridians. Some of them are written by monarchics. Some of them are written certainly by the Nestorians of that day, but they do not belong in any Word of God. They were never considered to be authoritative by the early church any more than the apocryphal accounts, the Jewish apocryphal accounts, were ever considered to be authoritative by the Jews. They are written by men. Nothing more, nothing less. So why have they been incorporated into the Quran? For one very good reason. Those who put the Quran together, and we're not going to talk about that today, they only had access to these stories because these are the stories that they heard orally by those that surrounded the Jews and the Christians that were there. They didn't bother to look at the written accounts. And the reason why is because both the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament had not been translated into Arabic. They were not translated into Arabic until the late 8th century. Therefore, they only had access to these stories, these apocryphal stories. And it is those stories that we have in the Quran today. Now, here's the question you need to ask yourself. Those of you who are Muslims who are watching this, can you then say that the Quran, this book here, really did come from God? If we can now show you that many of the stories incorporated are written by men, for men, we know when they were written, we know why they were written, we know, in many cases, exactly at the place that they were written, and certainly by whom. You've got to ask yourself a question. Do you trust those stories? And if so, if you believe that they still are authentic and that they do come from God, then why is it that these kind of source material, this kind of exercise in source criticism, when you apply it to the Bible, we don't have these difficulties. We don't have a problem of where they come from. We know exactly where they came from. We know who wrote them. The authors' names are given to many of them. We don't have this difficulty with the Bible. This is only a problem that you find with the Quran. But then you need to tell us, and you need to convince us that this does come from God. It cannot with this kind of man-made material. Failed man-made material. Confusion in some of the stories. I leave that for you now. Let's start the debate. I know it's going to be disturbing for some of you Muslims, but we need to talk about it, we need to debate it, and we need to come to conclusions. If you have a choice between these two books, the Quran and the Bible, come on back home to the Bible, because it does not have these problems. It is unique to the Quran. I leave it with you. This is Jay, over and out.